Hello everyone. Today we are going to review the 7 elements of art in preparation for our last project in which you're going to need to use all 7 of the elements of art in one piece. So to start, like I said, there are 7 elements of art, and at this point in time we've covered all 7 of them throughout the year. So the first one is line, the second is shape, the third is form, the fourth is space, the fifth is value, the sixth is color, and the seventh is texture. So we're going to go through each one of these individually, and I'm going to show you guys some examples of what each one of these looks like. So to start with, let's talk about line. So if you remember from the very beginning of the school year, and if any of you guys did the review material that I handed out a couple months ago, lines can all be different based on the direction. So we have vertical lines, we have horizontal lines, we have diagonal lines. Lines can also be different based on how thick they are or how thin they are. So these lines are all about the same thickness, but the lines that make up this word right here are a bit thicker. Lines can also be different colors. These are all black, but we could just as easily have red lines instead of black. We can have broken lines. This one is more of a bent line, but we could have a dotted line or a dashed line. Lines can be wavy, and lines can be curved. So there are all kinds of different types of line. And we can use line to create shading. So here we have hatching, and hatching you make single small marks that are generally all going in the same direction. These lines have a curve to them, and so they are changing direction slowly as they go around the surface of this ball. And then we have cross hatching, which is really similar, but you have diagonal lines. So the lines are crossing each other and are perpendicular. And cross hatching is a nice way to build up value, which means to make something darker. So I often prefer to do a combination of blending where I smooth all of my lines out and make them disappear, or cross hatching. I tend not to like hatching, but that's just a personal preference. It's really up to you. We didn't really cover scumbling, but it's a technique where you basically scribble in small circles. And then stippling is making really small dots. So stippling tends to be really time consuming. And we did work a tiny bit with stippling, but for the most part we didn't end up spending a lot of time on this. So moving on, let's talk about shapes. And this is something that a lot of you guys struggle with, which is the difference between geometric and organic shapes. So the way to distinguish first is, are there straight lines? Because geometric shapes are always going to have either straight lines or perfect symmetry. So obviously the rectangle and the triangle are geometric because they have straight edges, but so is this circle because it's a perfect circle, so it's perfectly even. And this little gear shape here has both straight lines and a perfect circle in the middle. And so that's what's making it geometric instead of organic. And then even this shape of the lamp down here, it has a trapezoid, and then it has this very perfectly symmetrical sort of semi-oval, and then another trapezoid at the bottom. Whereas organic shapes are irregular, so they're not perfectly symmetrical, and they are usually rounded. So they have curved edges, and that's what makes them organic. And then the other stumbling block is the difference between shapes and forms. So you guys often will flip this. And so the way to remember, the way that I remember, is that a shape is flat and two-dimensional, like old school emojis or computer icons. So when they first came out, they didn't have shading on them like they do now. They were really flat, and those are shapes. Whereas forms look three-dimensional. They're not actually three-dimensional because this is a flat screen, but they look three-dimensional. So you can tell that there's light hitting it, creating a highlight, and we have shadow. So it's the highlight and shadow that allows us to perceive this as being three-dimensional, even when it's really on a flat piece of paper. Space is one that most people understand the concept of, but they tend to struggle with how to actually create space in a drawing. So another term for space is depth, which means that we have stuff in the drawing that's really close to our viewpoint, and then we have stuff that's further away. And so we understand that. It's just like looking out at a scene, looking out a window, looking around a room. But how do we do that? So the first way that we do that is placement. Things that are placed further down the page, so here towards the bottom of the page or the painting, are going to look closer because the things that are placed higher up are going to be further away. So these cherries in the back look like they're further away because they're higher up the page. The next is detail. So of course, objects that are closer to us have a lot more detail. So here I can see the spot where the stem meets the cherry. There's a shadow here. I can see some highlights. I can see little details on the stem. Whereas here, all I see is there's like a little splash of pink, and then there's some red, and then there's a stem. I can't really see much more than that. The third way that we create space is through overlap. So whenever one object is overlapping another and blocking out our view of that object, we know that the object that's doing the blocking, that's overlapping, is in front. The next is size, which makes sense. We know that objects that are further away from us look smaller. Objects that are bigger are going to look closer. And then we have value, and this is where people tend to get confused. So the cherries in the back still have some value, meaning they have light and they have dark, but they're kind of light overall. And these cherries here, they have really dark areas and they have really white areas, but overall they're just a bit darker. The red is a darker red than the red that we see back here. And so let's talk about value so that you guys can understand value in the context of depth. So value is just how dark or how light something is. And when we have an object, parts of the object can be light, parts can be dark, and then we can almost kind of sum that together and say, overall, this object is dark or it's light. So overall, to me, this object is a little bit on the dark side, whereas these are kind of in the middle, maybe a little bit on the light side. So it's like you're averaging everything together. So value, when we think about value, something that is white has no value. So it's completely white, nothing has been added to it. And something that's completely black has the most value. And so a way that you can think about that or a way to remember it is to think about if you were using a pencil, you'd have to put down a lot of pencil to get a dark value. So think about the cost in time and the cost in pencil graphite that you would need to get a perfectly black spot, and that's going to have more value. And then in between white and black we have grays. So we can have very, very light grays that only have a little bit of value, and very dark grays that have a lot of value. And so when we are talking about space, objects that have a wide range of values are going to look closer to us. Now we can also have value in color instead of in black and white. So again here, this is, well, it looks like a pure white to me, so it has no value. This is a blue, but it's a very light blue. So it's a blue that's really close to white, so it has very little value. And this blue over here is close to black. It's not black. So we would say that this blue has a lot of value. color. We went over color. We went over color schemes recently, so hopefully this is pretty fresh. But this color is displayed on a color wheel. When you're laying out color wheels, it's really important to lay the colors out in the right order because otherwise the color wheel doesn't work. It's not really useful. And so when you lay out your colors, I like to start with my primaries, and it really doesn't matter which one you put at the top. It just matters that they have 3 spaces in between. So if I'm laying out my primaries, I go yellow, 1, 2, 3. Space number 4 is blue, 1, 2, 3. Space number 4 is red. So I could have yellow, blue, red, it wouldn't matter. What matters is that I put the secondary colors in between the right primary colors. So orange is going to go between yellow and red because when I mix yellow and red together, I get orange. Same thing with purple. I get that by mixing blue and red. And I get green by mixing blue and yellow. And then I can put my tertiary colors in between, and I don't have to think about what those are because I know that this color right here is going to be a combination of green and yellow. This color is going to be a combination of orange and red. So it's really important when you're setting up the color wheel to put those colors in the right spot. And along with that, we have our color schemes. So we're not going to go over these in detail because we just went over those recently. But remember that you've got monochrome, analogous, complementary, warm or cool, triadic, and split complement. And so the reason that we use color schemes is because these colors tend to look really pleasing when they're put together, or in the case of complementary, they look very bright. So they help us accomplish different things as artists. So we need to be aware of color schemes and how colors work together when we're choosing colors for a painting or for a colored pencil drawing. And then finally, our last element is texture. And so when we think about texture, we have to think about how much light bounces off or is reflected from a surface. And the terms for these different types of surfaces are matte and shiny. So shiny surfaces are easy to understand. We all know what a shiny surface is. It reflects a lot of light. And you can see here there's a really strong white highlight on this nail. There's a shadow here. It's not really strong. But always with shiny surfaces, you're going to have really, really bright spots of reflection. Whereas matte surfaces don't reflect a lot of light. So this looks, it looks like paint. It looks like it's a kind of a smooth, slick, almost wet surface. Whereas this isn't reflecting a lot of light. It's much more matte. So you can see there is a highlight here, but it's much less strong than the highlight over here. And then of course we have rough versus smooth. This is a little pixelated and blurry, but that's okay. We can see that this ice cream bar is very smooth, very flat surface, and this one is rough, so it has a very uneven surface. So that's how you distinguish between rough and smooth. And you can also think about how it would feel if you were touching it. So it would feel bumpy, it would feel uneven if you were to touch this with your hands. And that is our brief review of the 7 elements of art.